Weekend in the woods. It was a great day. It really was. It started off that way, anyway. I'm sure I remember. But now, it is not a great day. I love going hiking, I really do. But suddenly, I'm not having fun anymore. We've gone to our cabin in the woods before. Many, many times that I can remember. It's always been fun. Always. The scenery, the wildlife, the fresh air, always. But now, it's getting dark and I'm alone. I'm not even sure how I ended up here. It smells weird and everything looks the same, but also different. Something isn't right. I feel it. Wait. Where's James? I know he was with me just a minute ago. I know this. I remember. Get it together. You're losing focus. James. I have to find James. Stand up. My head, my leg, I feel pain. This is the road. I'm on the side of the road. There's blood on me. I'm hurt and James is gone and I don't know where I am. Start walking. He wouldn't have left me here. He must be close. Something must have happened. I can't remember. Noise and lights coming toward me. Bright lights hurts my eyes. Truck. Start running. It's not James. The lights pass right by. They don't see me. I call out, and they don't hear me. I'm alone. It's dark now, and I'm alone. Except, I'm not. There's something moving in the woods. Run faster. Wait. Maybe that's James. Maybe he needs my help. Maybe he's hurt too. I call out, and something moves deeper into the woods. Is he playing with me? James! We've been together for a while. I remember, it took some time for me to trust again, but James had earned it. He took care of me, and I took care of him. Try to remember. He didn't leave me. I was with him, and then I wasn't. Darkness in between. It didn't make sense. Head hurts. Try to focus. Another light flashes. Brighter, louder, faster. Panic. Someone is after me, and it's not James. A strange voice calls out to me. A word I have never heard and do not understand. Run, now. Into the woods. I'm safer here than on the road. Whatever happened to me and James happened back there. Just run. Grass, leaves, trees. Twigs snap beneath my feet. Branches scrape across my face. I close my eyes, put my head down, and run. Wait. Turn around. No one is chasing you. Breathe now, inspect your wounds. Pain returns. Heart pounds. It's really dark now. Strange sounds, unfamiliar scents. Blood has dried. A twig snaps behind me. James? Something is watching me, and it's not James. That smell. I freeze. Hair stands on end. Another twig snaps. I call out, trying to scare away whatever creature is lurking. It works. I am alone, again. Our cabin must be close by. I'm sure I remember. I inhale deeply, my pupils dilate. I know these woods. There are others in these woods. James told me about them, told me not to trust them. The others may even look like me, but they aren't like me. I keep my eyes open wide, and I move cautiously. I hear a scream in the distance. No sleep tonight. I am limping now. The air is cold and the ground is hard. This is not where I belong. I am not safe. Nothing is right. I feel it. The trees are moving. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. I'm tired. I'm scared. But I have to keep walking. I have to find the cabin. I have to find James. I can't let the others see me. I can't let the others catch me. I don't know what happens if they do, but James says I don't want to find out. Keep walking. Something sharp on the ground hurts my foot. I yelp out in pain. That was a mistake. Another scream, much closer this time. And another. And another. The others. They know I'm here. They're coming for me. Run. I think the cabin is this way. I hope the cabin is this way. Once I get closer, I'm sure I'll remember. I'll know. Just run. Don't turn around. Something is chasing you. Can't call for James. The others will hear me. Can't hide. The others will find me. I have to keep running and hope they don't catch me. I have to keep running as long as my leg lets me. Leaves rustle beside me. Sticks break behind me. The screams are all around me now. The smell is overpowering, driving me further and further away from the cabin, further and further away from James. I know it. I feel it. The others had heard my cry. They smell my blood. They sense my fear. They're coming. If only I could remember how I got here. I can't keep running. I can't escape. Focus. There is only one option left. Stop running. Turn around. Try to breathe. You're surrounded. Keep your eyes open wide, pupils dilated. Muscles tense. Teeth clenched. They may look like you, but they aren't like you. Heart pounding. Hair stands on end. The others appear in front of me. Behind me. On all sides of me. They aren't like me, they're bigger. I cannot move. I cannot breathe. I want to tell them to leave me alone, but I know they won't listen. If James were here, he would protect me. But he's not here. I'm alone. Surrounded and alone. A bright light flashes. A dark figure appears. It's running towards me. I freeze. It's getting closer. Heart pounds. Hair stands on end. A loud bang. The others run away. This is it. The bright light hurts my eyes. The dark figure is right in front of me now. It calls to me. A word I know. I understand. Pupils constrict. Inhale, exhale. James. James. I fall into his arms, and he cries. He hugs me. He hugs me harder than he's ever hugged me before. It hurts my head, but I don't care. I'm home now. Home with James again, where I belong. My wounds are dressed and my belly is full. The air is warm and the ground is soft. I'm safe. I'm not alone. No pain. Everything is right. I feel it. I know it. I remember. James says I fell from the truck. He doesn't know how. He went back to look for me, but I was gone. He says he's so sorry, and I forgive him. He didn't mean for our weekend in the woods to go this way. I knew he wouldn't have left me. He says it will never happen again, and I believe him. I curl up next to James in our bed. He scratches my head, and I close my eyes as he softly says my favorite word. Good boy. My mother hasn't been the same since I found an old recipe book. When I got the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't surprised. He was charming, reckless, and unpredictable, the kind of guy who knew his way around trouble and didn't seem to mind it. But this time felt different. It wasn't just a few months, he was facing 10 years. A decade behind bars for possession of over a pound of cocaine. They said it was hidden in the trunk of his car, packed away as casually as groceries. It stung. He'd promised us he was clean, that his wild years were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was on the straight and narrow. We had our doubts. Old habits don't vanish overnight, after all. But a pound? None of us had seen that coming. My uncle swore up and down the drugs weren't his, said he was framed, that someone wanted to see him gone for good. But when we pressed him on it, he'd just clam up, muttering that spending a decade locked away was better than what they would do to him. After he was sentenced, my mom called, her voice tight, asking if I could go to his place and sort through his things. It was typical family duty, the kind of thing I couldn't turn down. I wasn't close with him, but family ties run deep enough to leave you feeling responsible, even when you know you shouldn't. So, with him locked away for the next 10 years, I volunteered to clear out his apartment, move his things to storage. I didn't know why I was so eager, but maybe I felt like it was the least I could do. The place was a disaster, exactly as I expected. His kitchen cupboards were filled with thrift store pots and pans, each one more scratched and mismatched than the last. I could see him at the stove, cigarette dangling from his lips, stirring whatever random meal he'd thrown together in those beat-up pans. The living room was its own kind of graveyard. Ashtrays covered nearly every surface, filled with weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls were a deep, sickly yellow from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same shade, crusted over from the nasty habit that had stained every inch of the place. It was clear he hadn't cracked a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost wondering if the yellow residue would come off. It didn't. In one corner of the room was his pride and joy, a collection of Star Trek figurines and posters, lined up on a crooked shelf he'd likely hammered up himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always rambling about episodes I'd never seen and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, determined stares watched me pack up their home, my uncle's treasures boxed up and ready to be hidden away for who knew how long. It took a few days, but I finally got the majority of the place packed. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates to the storage facility across town, until the apartment was stripped bare. The only things left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-coated walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging in the windows. There was no way he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically baked into the place. But it didn't matter anymore. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen, my hand brushed against something tucked away in the shadows of the cabinet. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small, leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather soft from age, with a faint smell of cigarette smoke clinging to it. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with years of kitchen chaos, stains, smudges, and scribbled notes everywhere. The entries were scattered, written down in no particular order, almost as if whoever kept this book had jotted recipes down the moment they'd been created, without thought of organization. As I skimmed the pages, a feeling crept over me that this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who'd brought the family together, year after year, with his homemade dishes. Every holiday felt anchored by the meals he'd cooked, recipes no one had ever been able to quite replicate. This book could very well hold the secrets to those meals, a piece of him that had somehow made its way into my uncle's hands after my grandfather passed. And yet, I couldn't shake a strange sense of dread as I held it. The leather was cold against my hands, almost damp, and a chill worked its way through me as I turned the pages. It felt wrong, somehow, as if there was more in this book than family recipes. Curious about the book's origins, I brought it to my mom. She took one look at the looping handwriting on the yellowed pages and nodded, her face softening with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said, almost reverently, tracing her fingers along the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a look of surprise flickered across her face. She had been searching for the book for ages and had never realized her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, nostalgia mingled with something else, maybe a touch of sadness or reverence. I could tell this book meant a lot to her, which only strengthened my resolve to preserve it. "Could I hang on to it a little longer?" I asked. "I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself, so we don't lose any of his recipes." My mom agreed without hesitation, grateful that I was taking the time to safeguard something she hadn't known was still around. So I got to work. Over the next few weeks, in the gaps of my day-to-day life, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't too focused on the content itself, more concerned with making sure each recipe was clear and legible, and didn't pay close attention to the strange ingredients and odd notes scattered throughout. My only goal was to make the text accessible, giving life to a digital copy that would be preserved indefinitely. Once I finished, I spent a few hours merging the scanned images, piecing them together to create a seamless digital version. When it was finally done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The family recipes were now safe, and I thought that was the end of it. But that sense of unease I'd felt in the kitchen, holding that worn leather cover, lingered longer than I expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been a small side project, the kind I'd meant to follow up on by actually cooking a few of my grandfather's old dishes. But like so many side projects, I got wrapped up in other things and the book's contents drifted to the back of my mind, filed away and forgotten. Then Thanksgiving rolled around. I made my way to my parents' place, expecting the usual turkey, stuffing, and the familiar spread that had become tradition. When I got there, though, I noticed something different right away. A large bird sat in the middle of the table, roasted to perfection, but something about it didn't look right. It was too small for a turkey, and its skin looked darker, almost rougher than the golden brown I was used to. "Nice chicken," I said, figuring they'd switch things up for a change. My mom just shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said quietly. "It's a hen." I gave her a confused look. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to shrug it off with a quick explanation. Instead, she just stared at me, her eyes unfocused as if she were lost in thought. For a moment, her face seemed distant, almost blank, as though I'd asked a question she couldn't quite place. Then, suddenly, she blinked, her gaze snapping back to me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, a strange edge to her voice. Something about it made the hair on my arms prickle, but I pushed the feeling aside, figuring she'd just been caught up in the cooking chaos. Yet, as I looked at the bird again, a small flicker of unease crept in, settling in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen while my mom finished clearing the table. "What's the deal with Mom tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He just shrugged, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "You know how your mother is," he said with a small smile, as though her strange excitement was just one of those quirks. He didn't give it a second thought, already moving on. But I couldn't shake the weirdness. The whole meal had been off. The hen, unlike anything we had before, was coated in a sweet-smelling sauce that seemed to have a faint hint of walnut to it, almost masking its pale, ashen hue. The bird lay on a bed of unfamiliar greens, probably some sort of garnish, alongside perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes that seemed too neatly arranged, like it was all meant to look a certain way. The whole thing was far too elaborate for my mom's usual Thanksgiving style. When she finally sat, she led us in saying grace, her voice soft and reverent. As she began cutting into the hen, a strange glint of excitement lit up her face, one I wasn't used to seeing. She served it up, watching each of us intently as we took our first bites. I wasn't sure what I expected, but as I brought a piece to my mouth, I could tell right away this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving fare. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't pull apart easily, a far cry from the tender turkey or even chicken I was used to. Mom kept glancing between my dad and me with a kind of eager glee, as though she were waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling, her eyes wide, as if she were waiting for us to uncover some hidden secret. When I finally asked, "What's got you so excited, Mom?" she just smiled, her expression softening. "Oh, it's just this cookbook you found from Grandpa's things. It's like having a part of him here with every meal I make." She spoke with a reverence I hadn't heard in her voice for a long time, as though she were talking about more than just food. I gave her a nod, trying to humor her. "Tastes good," I said, hoping she'd ease up. I enjoyed it. But in truth, I wished we'd had a more familiar Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't exactly bad, but something tasted a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, and maybe I didn't want to. After we finished, I said my goodbyes and headed home, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. My mom's face, her excitement, kept replaying in my mind. And then there was the hen itself. Why a hen? Why the pale, ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic in the way she prepared it, a strange precision I'd never seen from her before. The night stretched on, the questions gnawing at me, taking root in a way that wouldn't let me rest. When I got home, I couldn't shake the weird feeling from dinner. I sat down at my desk, opening the scan file I'd saved to my desktop months ago. The folder had been sitting there, untouched, and now that I finally had it open, I could see why I'd put it off. The handwriting was dense and intricate, almost a kind of calligraphy, each letter curling into the next. The words seemed to dance across the pages in a strange, whimsical flow. I had to squint, leaning closer to make sense of each line. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill ran down my spine. They had unsettling names, the kind that felt more like old spells than recipes. Mother's Last Supper porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, Elder's amber bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I could almost feel a heaviness creeping into the room, the words themselves holding an eerie energy. Then, I found it, the recipe for the dish my mother had made tonight, Ancestors' Offering. The recipe was titled in that same swirling calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read the description. It was for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, though it didn't sound like any recipe I'd ever seen. The instructions were worded strangely, written in a style that made it feel centuries old. Each ingredient was listed with specific purpose and detail, as though it held some secret power. My eyes skimmed down to the meat. It specified a hen, not just any chicken. The body must be that of a mother, it read. I felt a shiver go through me, remembering the strange way my mom had insisted on using a hen, correcting me when I'd casually referred to it as chicken. The instructions continued, noting that the hen had to be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, a type of honeysuckle, according to a quick Google search. And then, as I read further, a chill seeped into my bones. The recipe stated it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I thought back to dinner, and the way we'd all sat down just as the last of the sun's light faded beyond the horizon. But the final instruction was the worst part, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in revulsion. The recipe called for something it referred to as ancestors' salt. The note at the bottom explained that this salt was a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I sat back, cold sweat breaking out across my skin as I recalled the pale, ashen sauce coating the hen, the faint, sweet scent it gave off. My mind raced, piecing together what it implied. Had my mom actually used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it was just some old folklore nonsense. But the image of her smiling face as she served us that meal, the gleam in her eyes, crept back into my mind. I felt my stomach churn, bile rising in my throat as the horrifying thought sank deeper. A few days later, the gnawing unease had become impossible to ignore. I told myself I was probably just overreacting, that the weird details in the recipe were nothing more than some strange family tradition I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake the dread that crept up every time I remembered that meal. So, I decided to call my mom. I planned it out, careful to come off as casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, about her gardening, anything to warm her up a bit. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even going so far as to say it was the best we had in years. When I finally brought up the recipe book, her voice brightened instantly. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, sounding genuinely pleased. I had no idea he'd cataloged so many wonderful recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was special, but to have all these dishes recorded, like his own little legacy, it's been such a joy. I chuckled, trying to keep my tone light. I actually looked up that dish you made us, Ancestors Offering. Thought maybe I'd give it a try myself sometime. "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was a little strange the recipe specifically calls for a hen and not just a regular chicken, since they're so much tougher. And the part that says it should be the body of a mother, I let the words hang, hoping she'd jump in with some explanation that would make it all seem less sinister." For a moment, there was just silence on her end. Then, quietly, she said, "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." Her voice was different now, lower, as if she were carefully choosing her words. My heart thumped in my chest, and I decided to press a little further. "I also noticed it calls for something called ancestors' salt," I said, feigning confusion, pretending I hadn't read the footnote that explicitly described it. "What's that supposed to be?" The silence was even longer this time, stretching out until it became a ringing hum in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I have to go," she murmured, sounding almost dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, leaving me in the heavy, stunned quiet. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. My stomach twisted as I stared at the blank screen. I couldn't tell if I was more scared of what I might find out or what I might already know. I hesitated, but eventually called my dad's phone, feeling a need to at least check in. When he picked up, I told him about my call with Mom and how strange she'd been acting. "She went into her garden right after you two spoke," he said, sounding unconcerned. "Started tending to her plants, hasn't said a word since." I tried nudging him a bit, asking if he could maybe get her to talk to me, but he just brushed it off. "You're overreacting. You know how your mother is, gets all sentimental over family things. It'll just upset her if you keep nagging her about it. Give her some space." I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. "Yeah, all right. You're probably right." After we hung up, I resolved to let it go and went about my day, chalking it up to my mom's usual habit of getting overly attached to anything with sentimental value. She always treated family heirlooms like they carried something sacred, almost magical. But this time, I couldn't fully shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind, something that made it impossible to forget about that recipe book. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Sitting back down at my computer, I opened the digital copy and scrolled aimlessly through the pages. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. I let the file skip down to a random section, thinking I'd try making something small, something harmless. As I scrolled, I found myself staring at the very last page, which held a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread. The instructions were minimal, yet each word seemed heavy, steeped in purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I shook my head, half amused, half unnerved. It was all nonsense, I told myself, probably just some old superstitions my grandfather had picked up along the way. But something about it had my heart pounding just a bit harder. Ignoring the rising chill, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. I'd play along, I figured. It was just bread, after all. I scanned the list of ingredients for Elder's Ember Bread, feeling time slip away as though I'd been pulled into some strange trance. My mind blurred over, details of the process fading into a fog, yet I couldn't stop moving. I gathered everything without really thinking about it, each step drawing me deeper, as though I were following some ancient, well-worn path. I remembered flashes, the sweet scent of elderberry and honey, the earthy weight of raw rye, the dry, pungent aroma of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point, I murmured something under my breath, words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't consciously decided to speak. The smell of warmed goat's milk lingered in the air, blending with a creamy, thick butter that had blackened over low heat. A faint scent of yew ash drifted up as I worked, curling into my nose like smoke from an unseen fire. By the time I came to my senses, night had fallen, the kitchen shadowed and still. And there, sitting on the counter, was the bread, a dark, dense loaf, blackened at the crust but glistening with an almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich and moist, and as I stared at it, a strange sense of pride swelled up within me, unnatural and unsettling, like a voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, insisting that I'd done well. Without really thinking, I cut myself a slice and carried it to the living room, feeling compelled to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky yet tinged with a subtle berry sweetness. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted before, but it was oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth bloomed deep in my chest, spreading through me like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as if the bread itself were warming me from the inside out. Before I knew it, I'd finished the entire slice. Not because I particularly enjoyed it, but because some strange sense of obligation had pushed me to finish every bite. When I set the plate down, the warmth remained, a heavy presence settled deep inside me. And in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint, rhythmic beat, a heartbeat, steady and ancient, pulsing faintly beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the Elder's Ember Bread more often than I intended. I'd notice myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing a thick piece from the loaf before even realizing I'd gotten up to do it. It was instinctive, almost as if some quiet impulse guided me back to it on those quiet, late nights. Each time I took a bite, that same deep warmth would swell inside me, radiating outward like embers glowing from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mother had made, a meal that left me with a lingering sense of discomfort, the ember bread felt different. It was as though each bite carried something I couldn't quite place, something familiar and almost affectionate, like a labor of love embedded into every grain. The days blended together, but the questions didn't go away. I tried to reach out to my mother several times, hoping she might open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange meals. But each time I brought it up, she'd evade the question, either changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. She hadn't invited me over for dinner since Thanksgiving, and the distance between us felt like a slow, widening gulf. Even my dad, when I'd asked about her, shrugged it off, saying she was just going through a phase. But the coldness in her responses, her repeated avoidance of the book, only made me more certain that there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept returning to the ember bread, feeling its subtle pull each time the sun set, as though I were being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it felt less like a meal and more like communion, a quiet bond that was growing stronger with every piece I consumed. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle at the prison. I was allowed to leave a message, so I kept it short, told him it was his nephew, wished him well, and let him know I'd left him $100 in commissary. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy over the line but appreciative. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a short chuckle. "You know how it is in here, money makes things easier." We chatted for a bit, catching up. He'd been in and out of prison so often that I'd come to see it as his way of life. In his 60s now, he talked about his time behind bars with a kind of acceptance, almost relief. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said, almost amused. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a breath and brought up the reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was packing up your place, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then quickly added, I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate. The warm, casual tone in his voice shifted, growing cold and sharp. "Listen to me," he said, each word weighted and deliberate. "If you have that book, you need to throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low, almost trembling. "That book, it brings out terrible things in people." He paused, as though considering how much to say. "My father, your grandfather, he was into some dark stuff you don't just find in the back of an old family recipe." "And that book?" He took a breath. "That book wasn't his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother, passed down to him before he even knew what it was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times." The gravity of his words settled into me, and I felt the weight of it all suddenly make sense. "They were used to survive hard times," he continued, voice quiet. "You've heard about what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate families were, but this..." He exhaled sharply. "Those recipes are ancient, passed down through whispers and word of mouth long before they were ever written down. But they're not for everyday meals. They're for invoking things, bringing things out. The kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful." My hand tightened around the phone as a cold shiver traced down my spine, my mind flashing back to the ember bread, the warmth it had left in my chest, the strange satisfaction that hadn't felt entirely my own. "Promise me," he continued, his voice almost pleading. "Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book for anything casual. Those recipes can keep a person alive in hard times, sure, but they weren't meant to be used, not unless you're ready to live with the consequences." A chill settled over me as I realized just how deep this all went. I hesitated, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I described Elder's ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, the warmth it filled me with, leaving out the part about how I'd almost felt compelled to eat it. He let out a harsh sigh and scolded me, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. "You shouldn't have touched that bread." None of it. Do you understand me? I felt a pang of guilt. I know. I'm sorry. I promise, I won't make anything else from the book. Good, he said, his voice calming a little. But that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she does something she can't take back. I tried to assure him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his tone deadly serious. You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't. Over the next few weeks, as Christmas approached, I stayed in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep our conversations going. Every time we talked, the discussion would circle back to the book. I'd tell him about my progress, or lack of it, how I tried visiting my mom, only for her to brush me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time. And each time I talked to her, she seemed to grow colder, more distant, as if that recipe book were slowly casting a shadow over her. One day, I decided to drop by without any notice at all. When I showed up on her doorstep, she didn't seem pleased to see me. You should have called first, she said with a forced smile. It's rude, you know, just showing up like this. Her tone was tight, her words clipped. I tried to play it off, shrugging and saying I just missed her and wanted to check in. But as I scanned the house, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I looked for any sign of the book, hoping I could find it and take it with me, but it was nowhere to be seen. Each time, I'd leave empty-handed, feeling like I was being watched from the shadows as I walked up the door. Every call with my uncle became more urgent, his insistence that I retrieve the book growing into a kind of desperation. You have to try harder, he'd say, his voice strained. If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen, you have to believe me. And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, and the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse waiting in that book. But it was more than that, something in my mom's voice, her distant gaze, even her scolding felt off. And every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, like I was getting closer to something I wasn't prepared to see. Christmas Day finally arrived, and despite my mother's recent evasions, there was no avoiding me this time. I gathered up the presents I'd bought for them, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping the tension that had grown between us would somehow ease in the warmth of the holiday. When I knocked, she opened the door and offered a quick, half-hearted hug. The scent of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I relaxed a little, hoping the day would be less tense than I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's fussing over, you know him." She gestured toward the dining room, where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I took off my coat, glancing back at her. She was already turned away, busying herself with the last touches on the table, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and I could sense the familiar warmth in her was missing. It was like she was there but somehow absent. Not wanting to disobey my mother on Christmas, I placed my gifts with the others under the tree and took my seat at the dining table. The plate in front of me was polished and waiting, a silver fork and knife perfectly aligned on either side, but the emptiness of it left an unsettling pit in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing back toward the hallway that led to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. The silence from him was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mother replied, her voice carrying from the kitchen. "He had a big breakfast, so he can join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about her response didn't sit right. It wasn't like my dad to skip a Christmas meal, not for any reason. A small, insistent thought tugged at me. Maybe it was the book again, casting shadows over everything in my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from the table. Before I'd even taken a step, she entered the dining room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost blackened, the glaze thick and rich, coating every crisscross cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her voice oddly stern, a hint of irritation slipping through her usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped, glancing from her to the closed door of the garage, the word special meal repeating in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad, that's all. I haven't even said hello." Her face tense, her grip tightening around the platter as her voice rose. "Sit down, and enjoy lunch with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was supposed to follow without question. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lying just beneath the surface of her insistence. "No," I snapped, my voice echoing through the dining room. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked at her, my words hanging thick in the silence, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face contorted, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." I took a step toward the garage, determined to get my dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. That book had wormed its way too deep into her mind. She shrieked and threw herself in front of the door, arms outstretched as if to block my path. Her face was flushed, her voice frantic. Don't go in there, please. Just sit down. Enjoy the meal, savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically pleading. There was a desperation in her voice that sounded like fear, not just of me but of what lay beyond that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her body a thin, shaky barrier. Please, she whispered, voice thin and desperate. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him. Dad," I called out, raising my voice over her pleas. Silence answered at first, followed by a muffled sound, a low, guttural moan, thick and unnatural, rising from the other side of the door. I froze, my blood turning cold as the sound slipped into a horrible, wet gurgle. My mother's face went white, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I'd heard him. I felt a surge of adrenaline take over, and before she could react, I shoved her aside and yanked open the door. The sight that met me would be seared into my memory forever. I stepped into the garage and froze, my stomach lurching at the scene before me. My dad lay sprawled across his workbench, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tied tightly with a belt just above the thigh, a makeshift tourniquet attempting to staunch the flow of blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh where his leg had been crudely severed, and blood pooled on the concrete floor beneath him, glistening in the cold fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved, trying to form words, a barely audible rasp escaping as he struggled to speak. "Help me!" I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my fingers shaking so badly it was hard to hit the right buttons. My mother's shrill screams erupted from behind me as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading. "Stop! Please, just sit down, just have lunch with me," she wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Her face was twisted in desperation, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I backed up, keeping a wide berth between her and my dad, and relayed the horror I was seeing to the dispatcher. "It's my dad. He's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, voice cracking. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher assured me that help was on the way, asking me to stay on the line, but my mother's desperate cries filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched at her head, her fingers digging into her scalp as she repeated, "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding, as I watched her spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. She only circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing against the house, and rushed into the garage to assess the situation. My mother resisted, screaming and flailing as they restrained her, her pleas becoming incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back and join her at the table. Paramedics rushed in and began working on my dad, quickly stabilizing him and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, barely able to process the scene that had unfolded. In the frigid December air, my mind reeled, looping over her chilling words and the horrible sight in that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and familiarity had turned into something I could barely comprehend, twisted into a nightmare I would never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes, but as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion: the book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone, staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop. The the digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I fear that it may have a hold on me. Oceans have always terrified me. Just the feeling of open water, not knowing how far below you something could be lurking in the depths, waiting to devour me with no rhyme or reason as to why, just the primal urge to feed. Figured getting away from Earth would solve that fear, especially considering Mars was mostly desert as far as the eyes could see. But you didn't know there's a whole terraforming colony up there already, did you? Yup, ever since the 90s when we sent the first small crew up, the world's governments have been steadily supplying scientists, builders, and equipment to Outpost Genesis. Work has been slow going, but we've seen a hell of a lot of progress over the couple of decades we've been up there. Hell, I've been doing 3-year on, 2-month off stints for the past 20 years, slowly helping to build up a survivable planet for my fellow humans. Honestly, though, I love it here. Things are different, sure, and I'm not entirely used to missing some Earth commodities after all these years, but knowing we're up here for a real, good reason is enough for me to look past all that. We've known for years now that the Earth wasn't going to be sustainable for life as we know it now, either due to climate issues or overpopulation eventually making things go bats hit insane. Hell, up here we even have a running bet on exactly what's going to cause Earth to blink out of existence first, and most of us are pretty sure it's going to be human hubris and violence. As cruel as the Earth could be to us, humanity was always finding ways to be even more cruel to each other. Up here, though, I didn't have to worry about that. Meals were taken care of, I had friends to go out drinking with after we got done with the tasks of the day, and things were honestly pretty comfortable. Maybe 400 of us lived up here in total, everyone with their own job and duty to the outpost. I do geographic surveys, picking out the best spots on the planet for new outposts, resource stations, things like that. The best part is, it pays well and I haven't had to spend a damn cent while I'm up here, so the account back home is bursting whenever I decide to retire. The sun came up and signaled a start to the day, waking me from a delightful dream to an awful, awful hangover. My head was pounding like someone was taking a jackhammer to the base of my skull, and the last thing I want to do is take a research buggy out with 2 other surveyors. Work is work though, and there's no calling out for hangovers up here unless you really, really want to get in trouble. So, against my will, for the most part, I met up with Sandra and Sho in the transport bay to get on the metaphorical road. "You look like shit," Sho said, laughing at me as I walked into the locker room. He was already halfway into his pressure suit, making sure everything was locked in and secured before we entered the atmosphere of Mars. "What time did you end up tapping out?" "Probably around 1. "You?" I asked, finding my way to the nearby sink so I could cold water on my face. It hit like a brick wall, waking me up much more. I was out of there by 11. Had my drinks, did my rounds, and my ass was in bed before midnight. He retorted. "Is Teller here yet?" Sandra said, busting into the locker room already suited up, a huge pack of supplies in her arms. Through the door into the transport garage, I could see our home for the day, one of the mobile survey labs that were scattered throughout the outpost. It was like a small RV, set up with seals, ventilation, and everything needed to do our jobs out in the harsh desert of the Red Planet. Morning was about all I could mumble back to her, dragging myself over to the locker containing my Atmos suit. I hated these things, even after all the years I've been using them, and it was like being put into a little cage. I went diving once in my life and it felt like the same thing, knowing that only the helmet you're wearing is keeping you from a terrible fate of suffocation, whether it be under the seas or in the hot sands right outside. "Told you. Should have gone to bed earlier last night instead of hitting that last Jack and Coke." Sandra was laughing now as well, turning back with her bag of supplies to load up the research vehicle. All I could do was grumble my discontent as I crawled into the Atmos suit, hearing the pressurized hiss as the last seal snapped into place. Sho walked up to the vehicle before I could leave the room, telling me I had 5 minutes to finish sobering up. What? They gonna give me a Martian DUI? I shot back, grumpier now. Not sure why I was so irritable today, but something just felt more off than usual. It took a few minutes, but we all finally loaded into the survey RV, making our way west toward the newest survey site. We had a lot of luck in the past few weeks discovering areas that could possibly support life, with the right push of course, and things were looking pretty bright for the first time in years up here. Maybe that's why I felt so off, the feeling that something could go wrong when everything was going so inexplicably right lately. The drive was a nightmare though. Know how the infrastructure on Mars is set up? It's not. Any expedition we took was traversing rough, red sand and rocky terrain, with the huge wheels on the RV barely able to handle some of the more jagged chunks of rock that would spike up from nowhere under the sands. I swear the wheels on this thing would tear up a whole mountain back home, but here every little rock they ran over felt like someone stabbing a dagger into the back of my head. Maybe 3 hours later we finally reached our destination. I might have ended up asleep if I wasn't the one driving, but Sho and Sandra decided to do their pre-survey checks on our way there, so I was left with the short stick. When we arrived, I could see why we were being sent to study this place. In the midst of the red sands that were stretching around for miles, this single formation of rock stood waiting. It wasn't quite big enough to be a mountain, but as tall as a 5-story building maybe. It went up high enough that we would probably need the entire day just to climb up. Seriously? We have to get up there? I said, letting out an even bigger groan than when we took off. Nope. Under it. Sho answered, heading past me out of the doors. I could see on closer inspection that there was a small opening at the base of the structure. A cave, entrance 4 wide enough for a small truck to pass through, was there, gaping open as if inviting us into the darkness beyond. Grab some flares and floodlights. We're going to take the buggy as far as we can. I pressed a button, loosing the small transport buggy we held in a small bay at the back of the survey RV. It rumbled out with a small hiss, the open cabin and bed in the back already piled with what we would need. Just in case though, we grabbed a few more of the flares and high-powered lamps. If it was dark, we were going to at least be prepared. Even with all the light we were holding in reserve, it took a moment to gather courage once we reached the cave mouth. Everything beyond was pitch black, a complete absence of any kind of light source. We turned on the brights on the buggy, and those were barely able to penetrate past the first few meters. All we could tell was that the ground sloped downward hard almost immediately, meaning we had a descent in store. Ready, boys? Sandra asked, looking to Sho and I both before pulling one of the flares from a bag. Might be making a discovery that will change humanity's future, after all. Been hearing that for years. Sho mentioned. Sandra chuckled, handing each of us flares to keep in our belt. We set off, brights cutting through the darkness maybe 20 meters ahead, with the abyss running endlessly ahead of us. The rumbling of our wheels echoed off high walls, crunching over hard rock beneath us. As we got further in, the rocky sand of Mars' surface gave way to solid, red stone. I found myself tapping the brakes more frequently as we went further down, the descent becoming steeper exponentially. Hey, think we're going to have to go on foot from here. Drop off is getting too dangerous for the buggy, I said, slowing down enough to pull the emergency and set it in park. Never thought I would need a parking brake on Mars. We set off on foot, loading up flashlights and flares, along with a few small light markers to find our way back more easily. Not like the path was very non-linear, but when you're underground it's easy to get disoriented. Our boots echoed loudly as we walked across the smooth, red rock, shining like a beautiful granite below us. It was so much more brilliant than the dull rock on the surface, almost mesmerizing in the swirling patterns set deep into the stone. Drip, drip, drip. All three of us stopped at the same time, the sound setting off billions of alarms in our minds that all pointed to that life-changing discovery: water on fucking Mars. We all looked at each other, not even daring to believe we were the ones to find something like this. We've been theorizing about this for decades, maybe centuries, but to be the ones that actually find it? We would be fucking gods back on Earth. No way, Sandra whispered. We're gonna be loaded. Sho was giggling already. Don't get your hopes up just yet. Our luck, it's fucking oil or something. I mentioned. Oh, so you Americans will be up here in no time. Sho laughed louder. We all kept moving forward, scanning the walls with bright flashlights, hoping to find the source of the drip. It took minutes of walking, the drip echoing louder through every step we took. Hey, it's in our Constitution, we're allowed. I retorted. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of that sweet, sweet oil money. Sandra chuckled as we walked on, still scanning, when we noticed a faint glow coming from further down, bright blue tinted red against the stone encasing us. We didn't stop, but I know I held my breath for the next few meters before we entered the huge, open cavern. Above us, a cavern of stars was spread out for miles, phosphorescent blue shining down from something on the stone roof. As we watched, the occasional drop would fall from them, landing atop the sprawling ocean split in front of us. The light reflected a deep red on the liquid surface below. A solid, shining pathway of rock divided the sea in front of us, glowing bright with the same bioluminescence. I pulled out a test tube from one of my belt compartments, moving to the edge of the liquid substance to take a sample. Don't just stick your hand in, Sandra shouted. I'm not an idiot, I mentioned, removing a small pair of tongs from another pocket. Gripping the tube tight enough to keep hold but loose enough not to shatter it, I made sure to go slow, dipping it down into the strange, subterranean ocean. It took more force than I expected, the substance being much more viscous than expected. When I pulled the tube back up, it was dripping from the outside, slowly joining the echo of whatever was falling from the ceiling. I capped it, shaking it off before bagging and wrapping it to protect the sample. After it was safely sealed up, I shined my flashlight on it to get a clearer look. It was a deep crimson, thick, and it looked like something was swirling around in it. Possible organisms in it. God, getting this under a microscope, we found something big, y'all. Should we go ahead further? Sho asked, walking to where the small pathway narrowed in, leading deep through the ocean cavern, a split in the Red Sea. He was shining his flashlight down the way, trying to see into the deep black punctuated by blue, glowing stars. There was no end in sight to the cavern, and the ceiling was so high the light's beam wouldn't even reach it, leaving the glowing stars above to their own devices. Not yet. I want to come down here more prepared first, Sandra said, standing to put away a sample of the phosphorescent material. Looks like a type of spore, but we need to have more light, some flotation devices for safety. Getting this back to the folks at base is going to be huge. Alright, so what? Mark it and head back to the rig? Or should we hit the gas back to base ASAP? I asked, stepping away from the edge. There was something about it that was making me feel odd. The discovery was something to be proud of, and I was happy about it, but there was this nagging sense, that feeling that I shouldn't be here. That nobody should be here, ever. Actually, I vote for hitting the base as fast as we can. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting the creeps. Same here, Sho replied. We packed it in, turning to leave. We were so focused on the sea in front of us that we didn't even think to look back at where the entrance. Now noticing the walls around the small cavern opening, dozens of etchings were in the cavern wall, stitched together in a bizarre series of shapes and drawings, making no comprehensible pattern from our perspective. Sho walked over, putting a hand up to one of the deeply carved lines in front of him. The smooth bores in the wall were finely crafted, put in with utmost care. So that doesn't happen naturally, I stammered out, approaching another section of the wall. Everything was immaculate. Compared to the rough, rocky surface above us, this was smooth, carved with passion by hands in reverence, or perhaps fear. That chill ran up my spine again as I stepped back, looking up to where the bizarre glyphs extended high to the cavern ceiling. There was no visible end, even with our high-powered lights, no telling what they became further up. Alright, that's enough for today. Let's head back. The ascent back up was taxing, the incline much more steep than it seemed on the way down. The thought kept coming into my head that there was something back there, waiting for us to turn our backs on it so it could sneak closer, getting the jump on us. Every time I looked back though, the empty cave greeted my eyes, with nothing to show beyond a blanket of darkness. By the time we made it back to the buggy, we were all completely exhausted, panting hard in the stale air of our suits. We loaded in, hitting the reverse and relying on autopilot to get us out of there and back to the surface in about 30 minutes, with only minor bumps and scrapes from the narrow sections of the tunnel. The glaring light of the surface was intense, sun baking down to give us a reminder of how hot the surface was than down below. The RV was there, covered in red dust as if it had been through a sandstorm. It took us a moment, but once everything was loaded in, we set off back to the base, samples in hand and eager to look closer once we returned. "Garage, we're coming in," I radioed once we began to get close. "Research vehicle returning, we've got some big news." "Tell her." "That you? Are Sho and Santa there too? Where the fuck have you been?" Comms responded, almost screaming into the mic. "We've been out at that research spot. You literally let us out this morning." I replied, confused. "You've been gone for 2 days. The hell did you do out there?" Comms asked back, confusion taking over the anger and fear in their voice. "Did something happen? Did you break down?" We got back into the garage within minutes, deciding to check in and debrief there rather than explain over comm systems. 2 higher-ups came in to meet with us, shuffling us into a small lab nearby. They didn't enter though, instead standing at the small observation window and speaking in through the comms system. "Do you have any explanation for being out for 2 days? You were supposed to be back within 12 hours of departure." One of the men said, General Pratt, an older man in charge of the U.S. interests up here on base. "We've been very concerned. A rescue mission was being organized when you 3 drove back up." Hao, leader of the Chinese delegation on the base, was looking at us with much less rage than Pratt was. "Look, we were gone for maybe 4 or 5 hours. We got to the designated point, found a cave, went down, stayed for a minute, came back up, now we're here. It's only been a short few hours." Sandra was trying to explain, but none of us were seeing eye to eye. Everything was off, and the concerned expressions on these 2 men's faces were making us all uncomfortable. "What about the suit footage?" "We have GoPros set up in those things, so just check them, you'll see." Sho was almost frantic, the prospect of that missing time almost breaking his brain. We had discussed it on the way in, with none of us able to account for it, all agreeing we were only gone for a few hours. The more we thought about it, the more it made sense though. The dust on the RV couldn't have gotten there in just those few hours, and there weren't any storms recorded in the area at the time we were gone, so where the hell did the time go? We're actually checking suit cameras right now. We don't know what in the world you found down there, But right now we're 7 hours in and the footage as soon as you get ready to leave down there just becomes still. You have your samples, you're packed up, talking about your discovery, then before you can turn around to leave everything gets weird. All three of you stop, standing like statues the entire time. We've got a couple of guys skimming the footage, but so far there's no change. The batteries on the cameras likely died during the time you were out, but that's not the biggest problem here. Pratt explained. That makes no damn sense. We would have run out of our air reserves. I mentioned. We only have 24 hours in those things, but there was enough for us to make it back. You took your damned helmets off. You didn't use any of your air reserves. Hal leveled, looking each of us in the eyes in turn. So how the hell are you here right now? We what? I stammered out. No, that makes no sense. We had our helmets on the entire time. None of us were stupid enough to take them off up here. That would be instant death. So what the hell? Look, there's no way any of us would have done that. We're not stupid. Wouldn't be up here if you were. Pratt said, looking into my eyes now, seriousness in his furrowed brow. But I need to know what the hell would make y'all do that. We don't know, sir, Sho whispered. Sandra was staring blankly in front of her, and he had his hands crossed in front of him in prayer. There was no telling what was going through their minds, but I know mine was racing with thoughts of the past few hours. I didn't feel any different. There was nothing off about my body. Once we got out of the Atmos suits, when we entered it was refreshing to breathe clean air again, but nothing indicated they were off before then. Look, we're going to keep you three in observation for a bit, just to make sure everything is baseline. Hal said, putting his hands up to calm us, despite everyone's dumbfounded, quiet state. We'll let you have lab 2 though, that way you can study your findings in the meantime. Sir, are we going to go back to Earth again? Sho asked, fear in his eyes now. He was thinking the same thing we were. Having no helmets on, especially down there, all kinds of possible pathogens or biological hazards could have gotten to us. There was no telling what we may have brought back to the base. God, what have we done? I don't know, Hal said, a heavy weight in his voice. I do know that your discovery will lead to immense advancements for humanity though, and you will be a part of history, no matter what. That's not promising, I muttered, looking at the lab around me. Where are my samples? They'll be brought in momentarily. We're cataloging items right now to be sure, Pratt said, nodding over to a small exchange door on the lab wall. Once it's ready, they'll put it through there. Throw some whiskey in there too, if you can. If I'm trapped here, at least let me drink, I mentioned, hoping for the best. Pratt just nodded, so I'm taking it as a good sign. The two officers walked away then, leaving us to ponder our own mortality for the foreseeable future. I tried to sit in one of the chairs in the corner, but something was making me stay up, only letting me pace nervously as we awaited the samples for study. Sandra was only staring ahead at the wall, while Sho was muttering to himself constantly, going over ways in his head to find out what may be wrong with us or if there was some way to test. We were in a lab, so not like there weren't resources around, but with the adult state our brains are in, there's no thinking straight like that. Maybe an hour, maybe 2, finally a bin was pushed through the exchange drawer, our sample vials inside along with a few other items from the RV, underneath, a bottle of Jack nestled in for all of us to split. I practically dove for it, desperate to see what we had found, what was keeping us in here, and for a drink. Look, I'm well aware at this point I probably have a problem. Least of my worries now, though. Taking a swig straight from the bottle, then offering it to the others who both shook their heads, I was ready to face whatever we were up against. One of the samples went into a test to see exactly what the hell it was, and I took a small drop, putting it right on a slide and barely getting it in place before pressing my eye to the scope. No. No fucking way, I said, focusing in on the scope dials to get a more clear look at what was below. Small, red cells formed and slipped around each other in the fluid. Sandra, Sho, I need you to look at this. What is it? Sho asked, coming forward. Sandra didn't respond for a moment, having to shake herself out of a stupor as I tapped her on the shoulder. Look and tell me what you think, I said, making room in front of the microscope for him. He put his eyes to the viewer, adjusting for a moment before gasping, stepping back and almost stumbling into one of the counters. Sandra stepped up to look and had the same response, falling to the ground and scrambling backward. Is that blood? Sho was holding his stomach, a dry heaving starting to work its way up to escape his mouth. Can't blame him, considering that was my first thought as well when seeing the red cells pulsating and moving past each other. Why is it moving? I don't know. I really don't know. I have some testing to see if it really is blood. There's something else in there too though, did you see it? I asked, adjusting the slide toward another direction. Look again. Sho peered back into the scope, gasping as he saw the same thing I did only moments ago. A small, dark organism moving its way through the red cells and eating them. I don't know if that's what it was actually doing, but just it touching the red cells made it begin to shrink, decaying to nothing before it moved on to another. Could that be in us? He asked, looking from me to Sandra. I noticed now his eyes were bloodshot, a dark red against pale skin. It creeps me out, but I'm chalking it up to lack of sleep. Hell, I probably look no better. The machine nearby dinged, telling me the first vial's component testing was done. Paper began feeding from the computer nearby, the results of the machine's work. I hesitated, swallowing the lump in my throat before grabbing the paper, ripping it off and closing my eyes as I brought it to my face. You have to look. Have to,